What you're about to hear may shake some of the most deeply rooted beliefs in the history of Christianity, challenge the role assigned to one of its most enigmatic female figures, and open the door to secrets that, according to many, were carefully hidden for centuries. Until now. Today we dive into one of the most fascinating and at the same time most controversial topics in early Christianity, the lost Gospel of Mary Magdalene. An ancient text excluded from the official canon that raises profound questions about spiritual leadership, hidden knowledge, and the silenced voice of women in the first Christian communities. Did this gospel really exist? What did it say? Why was it excluded? And what impact could rediscovering its message have today? Prepare for a journey through time, history, art, spirituality, and religious politics. Because this video is not just an exposition of facts, but a layered journey, a narrative and symbolic reconstruction that will take us from the sands of ancient Egypt to the secret workshops of the Renaissance, and perhaps to a new way of understanding faith. 1. Who was Mary Magdalene, according to the Bible? To understand the impact of the so-called Gospel of Mary, we must begin with the figure who bears its name. Mary Magdalene appears in the canonical Gospels as a close follower of Jesus, a witness to his crucifixion, and the first person to see him resurrected, according to the Gospel of John. An extraordinary role. However, for centuries she was reduced to a much more limited image, that of the repentant sinner. In many homilies and artistic representations, she was confused with other women mentioned in the Gospels, such as the adulterous woman or the one who anointed Jesus' feet with perfume. That fusion of identities, promoted particularly from the 6th century onward, turned Mary Magdalene into a symbol of repentance and redemption, but also into a subordinate figure. Why did this happen? Was it by mistake, by intention, or by strategy? There's no single answer, but there are multiple clues. In a church where male leadership was predominant from its institutional beginnings, pushing Mary Magdalene into a secondary role may have served a structure that did not envision women with spiritual authority. And yet the clues in the original texts, and even more so in the apocryphal writings, suggest a different story. One that is richer, deeper, and dangerous to the status quo. 2. The world of the Gnostic Gospels. Before diving into the Gospel of Mary itself, it is crucial to understand the context of Gnosticism. This school of thought, which flourished during the first centuries of the Christian era, proposed that salvation did not come through ritual or obedience, but through inner knowledge, gnosis. A spiritual enlightenment that allowed the soul to break free from the corrupt material world. Gnostics saw the body as a prison and the soul as a divine spark trapped within it. In this worldview, Jesus did not come to establish an institutional religion, but to awaken that spark through secret and deeply symbolic teachings. And here Mary Magdalene enters the scene. In many Gnostic texts, including the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, and the Gospel of Thomas, she appears as a privileged disciple, the one who truly understood the Master's words. Her closeness to Jesus was not superficial, but deep, spiritual, and visionary. 3. What is the Gospel of Mary Magdalene? The so-called Gospel of Mary was discovered in a Coptic papyrus included in what is now known as the Berlin Codex, found in Egypt in 1896. Unfortunately, the text is incomplete. The opening pages and part of the ending are missing. Still, what survives is enough to spark intense and provocative debates. In the text, Jesus has risen from the dead and speaks with his disciples about the nature of the soul, sin, and true knowledge. After he departs, the disciples are left confused and afraid. It is then that Mary speaks, comforts them, and shares a vision the Master had entrusted to her in private. She describes a journey of the soul through 7 powers, entities or levels of spiritual existence that must be overcome to reach enlightenment. Each power represents an inner obstacle: darkness, ignorance, lust, the craving for death, among others. It is a metaphor for awakening, a spiritual guide that suggests liberation is not achieved through external obedience, but through deep inner work. Peter, one of the disciples, reacts with discomfort. He questions why Jesus would share such revelations with a woman and not with them. Mary defends herself, and Levi, Matthew, steps in to say that if the Master deemed her worthy, they should as well. This brief yet powerful exchange encapsulates a conflict that runs through the entire history of Christianity, the clash between institutional authority and spiritual experience, between patriarchal power and female leadership, between the public and the intimate. 4. Why was this gospel excluded from the canon? To answer this question, we must travel to the heart of the early centuries of Christianity. At that time, there was no unified Bible or single doctrine. There were multiple Christian communities scattered throughout the Roman Empire, each with its own texts, rituals, and interpretations of who Jesus was and what his message meant. Some groups emphasized the physical resurrection, others the spiritual resurrection. Some followed Peter, others Thomas, others James, and others Mary Magdalene. It was a plural, fluid, and experimental Christianity. But such diversity also caused conflicts. As Christianity grew in numbers and influence, the need to unify doctrine became pressing. To achieve this, leaders like Irenaeus of Lyon began to fight what they called heresies and to define which texts were acceptable and which were not. The councils, such as the Council of Nicaea in the year 325, not only debated theological matters but also began to consolidate a list of sacred texts, what we now know as the New Testament canon. Gospels like that of Mary, Thomas, or Philip were excluded. Why? Because they contain Gnostic visions, which emphasized inner knowledge over sacraments. Because they gave prominence to uncomfortable characters, like Mary Magdalene, in positions of authority. Because they challenged the hierarchical structure the church was building. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene wasn't just theologically different. It was potentially subversive. It placed a woman as the bearer of Jesus' deepest message, and it suggested that salvation didn't depend on an institution, but on personal experience. 5. The discovery of Nag Hammadi and the revelation of the Gnostic texts. The 20th century marked a turning point in the history of ancient Christian texts. In 1945, in the region of Nag Hammadi, Egypt, some farmers discovered a sealed jar that contained Coptic codices, carefully hidden for centuries. What they found was a spiritual treasure, over 50 Gnostic treatises, many of which were believed to be lost forever. Among them were the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Philip, and other texts offering a radically different view of early Christianity. Although the Gospel of Mary was not among them, the rediscovery of these writings rekindled interest in all apocryphal and marginalized Gospels. Since then, scholars, theologians, and mystics from around the world have studied, translated, and analyzed these works, not merely as historical oddities, but as windows into a lost spirituality, a tradition that had been silenced for centuries. 6. Was Mary Magdalene the wife of Jesus, the Da Vinci Code and beyond? One of the most provocative questions that emerged from this renewed interest was there an intimate relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene? Dan Brown's novel, The Da Vinci Code, popularized a theory that had already been circulating in esoteric circles for decades, that Mary Magdalene was not just a disciple, but the wife of Jesus, and that their descendants were secretly protected by orders such as the Priory of Sion or the Templars. According to this view, Leonardo da Vinci, familiar with these secrets, supposedly hid clues in his works, especially the Last Supper. In it, the figure traditionally identified as John appears with markedly feminine features, and the V-shaped space between him and Jesus would symbolize the womb, the divine feminine, or even the lost bloodline of Christ. These ideas do not have academic consensus and have been widely criticized by historians, but their popularity lies not so much in their literal truth, but in the symbolism they evoke. The need to revalue the feminine in religious traditions, and to recover figures that were erased or distorted by centuries of patriarchal history. 7. The current impact: religion, feminism, and alternative spirituality. Today, speaking about Mary Magdalene is no longer just a theological matter. She has become a symbol, a banner for voices that were once silenced and that now seek to reclaim their place. In alternative spiritual movements, she is seen as a priestess, an initiate, a bearer of the divine feminine principle. Even within institutional Christianity, progress has been made. In 2016, Pope Francis elevated the commemoration of Mary Magdalene to the rank of liturgical feast, placing her on the same level as the apostles, a symbolic gesture that acknowledges her prominent role, though it still stops short of validating Gnostic texts as part of the official tradition. In contemporary art, feminist theology, healing circles, and holistic spirituality, Mary Magdalene has been resignified. No longer is she the redeemed sinner, but the hidden teacher, the voice that invites us to look inward, to reconcile reason and intuition, history and mystery. 8. Is all of this true? What can we believe? Faced with so much information, the big question arises. What is true and what is fiction? How can we know? The honest answer is, we don't know for certain. History is made up of fragmentary documents, interpretations, and silences. We know what has been preserved. We do not know how much has been lost. We can compare texts, study contexts, look for connections, but in the end, each person must decide from where they choose to see. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene may not hold the same doctrinal authority as the canonical Gospels, but it possesses a profound symbolic power, a wisdom that resonates with many who feel that official religion did not give them all the answers. Perhaps it's not even about choosing between one set of texts or another, but about learning to listen to the full spectrum of the Christian tradition, its official voices and its marginal whispers, its institutions and its rebellions, its certainties and its open questions. 9. Modern interpretations and the academic perspective. Since the 1970s, with the rise of Gnostic text studies and the growth of critical theological approaches, the Gospel of Mary has been the subject of detailed analysis in universities, seminaries, and biblical research centers. One of the most influential figures in this field is Karen L. King, a historian of religion at Harvard University, who has worked extensively with Coptic Christian texts. King argues that the Gospel of Mary should not be seen merely as a Gnostic heresy or esoteric fiction, but as a valuable testimony to the theological and spiritual diversity of early Christianity. In her analysis, Mary is not a secret wife or romantic figure, but a true spiritual leader, comparable in authority to any male apostle. Other scholars, such as Elaine Pagels, have also explored the richness of Gnostic texts as part of a repressed Christian tradition, one that is more introspective, less focused on external authority, and deeply engaged with personal experience of the divine. The goal is not to claim that these texts are more true than the canonical Gospels, but to acknowledge that the history of Christianity was more plural and conflicted than is often admitted. And in that plurality, Mary Magdalene emerges as a disruptive figure because she represented another possibility, that of a Christianity more inward, more egalitarian, more visionary. 10. Mary Magdalene as a psychological archetype. The figure of Mary Magdalene has also been reinterpreted from the perspective of depth psychology, especially by those who follow the legacy of Carl Jung and archetypal psychology. In this view, Mary represents a powerful feminine archetype, the wise woman, the initiate, the one who descends into the shadow and returns with light. She is the figure who has been misunderstood, rejected, or cast out, and yet holds an essential truth. In the Gospel of Mary, as her soul passes through the 7 powers, she overcomes the obstacles of ego, desire, and ignorance. This process symbolizes the inner journey of the human being toward individuation, the awakening of their deepest consciousness. As an archetype, Mary Magdalene is also a bridge between the spiritual world and the emotional realm. She represents the possibility of uniting the rational and the intuitive, the masculine and the feminine, logos and eros. This is why many people, regardless of their religious beliefs, find inspiration in her story for their own personal journey. A silent guide who, though unrecognized for centuries, never ceased to speak to the human soul. 11. The symbolism of the lost. What does a forgotten book tell us? The title by which this gospel is popularly known, The Lost Book of Mary Magdalene, carries a powerful resonance, not only because it refers to a text that was lost and fragmentary, but because it embodies the yearning to recover what history has buried. Forgotten voices, alternative paths, discarded possibilities. In a broader sense, the lost can also refer to our connection with the sacred through the feminine, through inner experience, through the symbolic. We live in an age that constantly seeks to reconnect with what was left behind. whether through ancient rituals, non-dogmatic spiritualities, or integrative wisdom traditions. Just as other ancient texts have returned to light, like the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Nag Hammadi codices, there remains hope that more documents are still hidden, waiting for the right moment to speak to the modern world. Perhaps in a desert library, a sealed cave, or even in still living oral traditions. And even if those texts never reappear, we are still left with their echo, their influence, their essential message. That truth is not always found on the surface, nor in the official version, and that sometimes the most transformative knowledge resides in what has been forgotten, marginalized, or denied. 12. What does the Gospel of Mary teach us today? Beyond its historical or theological value, the Gospel of Mary offers a lesson that transcends the centuries. Salvation is a path of self-knowledge, of inner liberation, and of spiritual courage. It reminds us that there are many ways to understand the divine, that women, too, were entrusted with profound wisdom, and that truth does not belong to any institution, but can emerge from an honest encounter with oneself. It also invites us to reconcile dualities, reason and emotion, science and faith, tradition and renewal, masculine and feminine. In times of fragmentation, its Gnostic message suggests unity, integration, wholeness. Perhaps this is why it continues to fascinate believers, agnostics, researchers, artists, and spiritual seekers around the world. Because it's not just about ancient history. It's about a living memory that resonates with our present, our struggles, our questions.